Our final speaker is has been let down transport-wise, but will be joining us later on. So we'll, I think, just slightly amend our running order and go ahead. My name is Aoife Nolan. I'm an academic expert here at Doughty Street Chambers, and I also work at the University of Nottingham. I co-lead the Children's Rights Group, and I'm absolutely delighted to invite you all here today on behalf of Shushin Liu and myself and the Children's Rights Group. And the Children's Rights Group at Doughty brings together barristers from across all practice teams to focus on innovative legal advocacy aimed at securing the rights set out in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we're here this evening to talk about the very pressing issue of child poverty and child rights. And as everyone here in this room will know, on the 17th of July of this year, the Prime Minister announced the creation of a new ministerial child poverty task force to oversee, and I quote, the development and publication of an ambitious cross-government child poverty strategy to reduce and alleviate child poverty. And according to the terms of reference documents of the task force, we can expect to see the publication of a full child poverty strategy with metrics that can be tracked in spring of next year. Okay? And this event is in response to that announcement and subsequent developments. And of course, as again, nearly everyone in this room is going to know, the terms of reference of the task force do not refer to children's rights, and nor indeed does the government's first report on developing the strategy that was published last month. However, the work of the task force is fundamentally linked to child rights. Child poverty and child rights are inextricably linked. Child poverty is a potential cause of child rights violations through the impact of child poverty on children's enjoyment of their rights. It's a potential outcome of such violations. In other words, where you don't satisfy children's rights, the result is child poverty. And of course, child poverty is in and of itself a violation of a wide range of child rights. So really, to think about child poverty without thinking about child rights is, to only consider very much a small part of the picture. And bearing this in mind, our aim with you this evening is to take a hard look at the opportunities and the challenges that are presented by the current moment, by the existing policy and legislative ecosystem when it comes to address to child poverty. How can we leverage those opportunities? How can we address those risks so as to secure children's rights in poverty-related areas? And to be clear, there's a real need to do so. And we're going to have, I'm sure, loads of statistics in the evening from yourselves, from the panel, but I'm going to just mention two here. And the first is referred to in the task force's terms of reference. Child poverty has increased by 700,000 children since 2010, with over 4 million children now growing up in a low-income family. And the other statistic comes from a study from the Social Metrics Commission that came out this week, front page, top story in The Guardian, which found that in 2022 to 23, the period of the study, found that more than a third of all children, 36%, were in poverty. And strikingly, not only was this an extremely high level when compared to, say, EU country comparators, it's almost a 5 percentage point increase since 2020 and the highest increase of poverty amongst any group. So child poverty is worsening and children are generally getting poorer faster than any other group in society. That sets the backdrop. I'm sure we'll come back in on the point of children's rights later on. I just want to finish my comments by observing that the UK's at this point very poor, but hopefully to be improved record in child poverty has certainly not gone unnoticed internationally. In June of last year, having looked at the UK's child rights record, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child noted with deep concern the large number of children living in poverty, food insecurity and homelessness. And this is simply the most recent of a series of criticisms on the part of UN treaty bodies. Last March, the Council of Europe European Committee of Social Rights found that the United Kingdom was not in conformity with its child rights obligations under the European Social Charter on the ground that the rate of child poverty is too high. So we're in trouble in terms of our international human rights obligations and our regional human rights obligations. Child poverty equals child rights violations. So that's where we're at. The key question is where we in the UK go next. And I think you can agree that we have an outstanding set of expert speakers to help stimulate our thinking on this. Now, the way we're going to work the event is this. It is being recorded, just to flag this to you in case you wish to say something outrageous. We encourage it. It's merely that it will be captured for eternity. So perhaps bear that in mind. Our plan is to have a series of kind of fairly short inputs and presentations from speakers, and then throw it open to the floor for what will be a moderated conversation. It can be questions, it can be comments or whatever, focused on risks and opportunities for pushing forward in this area now. Feel free to blue sky or tweet DSC child rights, but please don't directly quote speakers, just in case something is misconstrued on the way. So anyway, that's enough for me. There is a reception at the end, as you can see, tantalizingly set out in front of you. And if anyone needs a glass of water or whatever during the whole thing, please do feel free to have it. I'm now going to hand over to Anna Feuchtwang. Anna is Chief Executive of the National Children's Bureau, who is going to speak to us briefly, but also introduce the first of her colleagues, and her second will join us later on today. So thank you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Aoife. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to introduce Amir, and as Aoife said, we have two people working with NCB through two of our young people's groups who are going to be the main speakers for us tonight, both of them with lived experience, one of whose lived experience is preventing him from getting here, but we're hoping he is now on his way in his wheelchair. So just to sort of add a bit of context, which Aoife asked me to give, based on the work that we're doing at the National Children's Bureau. So of that 4.3 million children, I think it's really important to put that in context. That's 9 children in every classroom is living in poverty. And another bit of context for that, of the children in poverty, 47% of children of a Black and global majority background are living in poverty, compared to 24% of white children. In households where someone has a disability, they are significantly more likely to be in poverty. And recent research has highlighted that half of households in poverty have at least one family member with a disability. So this is a really critical issue for us, the National Children's Bureau. We are really pleased that the government has published plans for a strategy, so it's some way off what we're looking for, which is action. But we're pleased that there's something happening, and that the government have been engaging us and many others on it. On behalf of the End Child Poverty Coalition, the National Children's Bureau has put together 8 key tests for that plan. So we will be holding that plan to those tests, and I can talk about that later in the Q&A. But the main things that we're asking for is reforms to the welfare system, a bill to eradicate child poverty, and last but by far no means least, proper resourced investment in the children's services that can support young people and their families, because without those, we're not really going to achieve ends to poverty. But before I say any more, I want to hand over to Amir Arian, who is a member of our Department for Education group looking for children who have been involved in the care system. Do you want to turn this?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Hi, I'm Amir, and I work for NCB and on the Department of Education Advisory Board. And yeah, great to meet you all, obviously. So first of all, thank you for taking your time to listen. Just a bit of a background of who I am. I came to the UK as an accompanied asylum seeker children at age 14, and been through different care homes, foster carers, been through the system basically. And with that, I want to share with you some quite eye-opening truths about child poverty in the UK. Particularly the struggles faced by young people leaving care, and how these challenges continue to shape their lives long after they've left the system and the care. I grew up in a care system myself, as I mentioned, and I've personally experienced the harsh realities of the homeless poverty and the overwhelming of being basically abandoned by a system that was designed to support me. So these are not just the statistics for me, they are part of my own story. When I turned 17 and a half, I had to leave my foster care placement, but I quickly learned that leaving care doesn't mean you suddenly have the support you need to make it on your own. At that time, I was going to get into a school in Buckinghamshire called Dr. Chandler Grammar School, not important. But basically, because I was going to a school outside the borough that I was under the care of, the support wasn't available. And basically, I was on my own. And 17 and a half, when I left my last foster care, obviously, I became homeless with no safety net. I managed to find a room with YMCA. And the cost, believe it or not, was a staggering £900 a month with YMCA. It was a charity. It was supposed to support and provide more affordable accommodation. So as you can imagine, it was quite almost not sustainable at all. So sadly, my experience is not unique, as you mostly aware of. In fact, third of care leavers experience homelessness within the first 2 years of leaving care. These are terrifying statistics that highlight the vulnerability of young people who are already facing huge obstacles and barriers to stability. In the UK, at the moment, 25% of homeless population are estimated to be in care. These young people, already traumatized by the care system, face even greater difficulties when they try to transition into adulthood. What's even more alarming is the fact that by the end of 2023, there has been 33% increase in homelessness among care leavers. This is a crisis that is getting worse, not any better. Without stable housing and support, many care leavers are left to fend for themselves in a world that doesn't seem to care. And it's not just housing. Care leavers also face huge obstacles when it comes to education, employment, and social mobility in general. Research shows that the care leavers are less likely to go to university, only 13% into higher education compared to the 43% in general public. This gap in educational opportunities basically perpetuates the cycle of poverty and social exclusion that so many care leavers experience. In addition to education, many care leavers struggle to find stable employment as well. 41% of 19 to 21-year-old care leavers are not in education, employment, or training, which obviously, as you know, they call it NEET. The statistics are even more stark as they get older. Only 22% of care leavers aged 20 are in employment, 22%, compared to 57% with their non-care peers. Even when care leavers do manage to find work eventually, they face a £6,000 pay gap compared to their non-care peers as well. This pay gap is a direct consequence of the lack of access to opportunities and the extra barriers that the care leavers face. The cost of living crisis, as I'm sure everybody is aware of, is only making these issues worse. In fact, almost half of foster carers are now considering quitting due to rising cost of living. This is deeply concerning statistics because it means fewer children will have access to support and care they need. And more children will be placed in unregulated accommodation, which is a situation that brings with it even greater risk of instability. As someone who lived through this, I can tell you the system is failing us. After leaving care, I often felt I had no one to turn to. And there was no one, absolutely no one, helped me figure out how to navigate life at that point. I was lucky to find a staff member at my own school, which took me in. And during one of my most difficult times, this person and their family became my support network and my family. And with their support and help, I basically managed to just graduate from medical school 2 weeks ago. But not every care leaver is so fortunate as me. Many people are forced to rely on sofa surfing, bouncing from one temporary accommodation to another. A quarter of homeless care leavers are in this situation. The lack of stable, affordable housing is also a major factor that leaves young people vulnerable and at risk of falling into further cycle of poverty and homelessness. Moreover, the care system doesn't equip us with emotional or practical support we need to thrive as adults. Without a family to fall back, many care leavers struggle with feeling of isolation and lack of direction. The truth is, they're all set up to fail, basically, and rather to succeed. This is a systematic issue that demands change. We need to ensure that care leavers are given the same opportunity as their peers. Stable housing, affordable accommodation, and affordable education, access to care support, a network of people like myself, which I mentioned, who can provide guidance and encouragement. For me, my time working as a home search volunteer with Crisis during the university, which is some of you might be aware of, a charity supporting homelessness and homeless people, opened my eyes to see how many of the individuals I was helping, our members, were also care experienced. It was a painful reminder of how the cycle of homelessness doesn't end just because you left care. Many of the people we helped were facing the same struggles than I did, because the system had failed them in the same way that it failed me. But it doesn't have to be like this. If we as a society can provide more support to care leavers, if we can offer affordable housing, safe and secure housing, if we can dismantle the stigmas around being care experienced, and in my own personal experience, the stigmas around being an unaccompanied asylum seeker, especially with the current event in the last couple of months that you probably saw, we can break the cycle of homelessness and poverty. We must fight for a system that gives every young person, regardless of their background, the chance to build a better future.
Before we go on to our next speaker, thank you so much for that, Amir. I mean, it's very powerful, it was very important, but I also want to say congratulations on the incredible achievement of graduation from medical school, because that is fabulous news for anyone, but phenomenally impressive given what you've already spoken about. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to turn to our next speaker, to Alison Garnham, who many of you will know through her work leading as Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group. And I think Alison is going to share some thoughts from her perspective, from CPAG's perspective, in terms of the current context and where there's possibility for progress and where perhaps there are smaller possibilities for progress, shall we say.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Thank you. As an organisation, we're actually delighted at the moment. We had as our top 2 strategic objectives of the last several years to achieve support for a comprehensive strategy to prevent and end child poverty, and political support for a renewed vision for social security. So now that we have a government committed to developing a cross-government child poverty strategy and to review universal credit, it comes pretty close to success in voluntary sector terms to get those things actually on the agenda. So we're delighted from that point of view. But the hard work begins now. The child poverty strategy is going to take a while to develop. They're going to publish in spring along with the comprehensive spending review. But the new child poverty strategy should know that what we know in the UK is that child poverty absolutely responds to policy, because we've done it before. We've done this before in the UK. We had a successful child poverty strategy before. We know how to make it happen. The last child poverty strategy resulted in over 1 million children being lifted out of poverty through things like increases in tax credits and child benefit, as well as through policies targeted at families with children. We had the first ever Childcare Act, Free early years education entitlement was introduced with the promise of extended schools, the new deals, the national minimum wage came in, family nurse partnerships, Sure Start, education reforms, educational maintenance allowances. It's easy to forget these were all new. These were all new at the time, we'd never had them before. That makes me feel optimistic, but there's an awful lot to do. And families are in a bad place. As Aoife just said, child poverty rose by 700,000 after 2010 to 4.3 million. That's 9 children in every class of 30. And poverty is deeper than ever. I think we had the largest increase in relative child poverty between 2014 and 21 of any advanced economy, according to UNICEF. And more than 1 in 5 children, that's 900,000, are in food insecure households. We worked in schools through a cost of the school day project, and we know from that kids are arriving at school hungry, they feel less safe, they're more likely to be absent, experience bullying, experience poor mental health, they can't afford the school equipment they need, they miss out on everyday experiences like school trips, they return to cold homes, and none of this is inevitable. We've actually been living through a historic poverty-producing period. Benefits for families rose by inflation in only 5 out of the last, actual inflation that is, in only 5 out of the last 14 years. Pensioners had the triple lock, children had nothing. There were over 50 cuts and freezes to benefits after 2010. We now spend around 50 billion a year less on social security than we would have done without those cuts, and that's based on OBR figures. It's a huge amount. So our approach has been to say, first of all, we need to remove the cuts that are driving up child poverty. Second, we need to invest in the policies that will prevent and reduce child poverty. And third, imagine a society with no child poverty and develop a strategy to eliminate it. And I have to start with some of the most egregious policies that we all know about, like the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. They are the biggest drivers of rising child poverty today. And they need to be removed as a first step, or child poverty will carry on rising, never mind falling. Abolishing the benefit cap reduces the depth of poverty for about 250,000 children. Abolishing the 2-child limit would lift 300,000 children out of poverty, and 700,000 would be in less deep poverty. We also want to see child benefit restored. It's lost 20% of its value since 2010, and extend free school meals. So those are just some of the things that we'll be calling for. We'll also be reminding the government that the cost of child poverty to the country is huge. It's about 40 billion a year. So that reminds us that investing in children and families is money well spent. If you want growth, investing in children brings similarly large growth to the economy, as well as preventing harm to children. In 2020, we produced a book called 2020 Vision, Ending Child Poverty for Good, where we set out what we thought a strategy should look like. I won't go through it now, or I'll run out of time. So we've been calling for this for a long time, and some of the things that I'll be saying that we still need are based on that. So what's been happening? The strategy is in progress. The government hit the ground running. They set up the task force, led by Bridget Phillipson and Liz Kendall, so DFE and DWP both involved. There was some progress in the budget. There was a reduction in the amount that can be taken for debts from universal credit. There was public investment once again in health and education, money for SEN, breakfast clubs, increases to the earning limit for carers allowance, which was very welcome, and an extension of the household support fund. But this is kind of like very small sort of starting things. We were bitterly disappointed, however, that they didn't take the opportunity to abolish the 2-child limit and benefit cap, because that would put them on the trajectory of child poverty stopping increasing. So between now and when the child poverty strategy comes out, about 16,000 more children are going to fall into poverty as a result. So about 109 a day. So that was a missed opportunity. But the document was produced in October, Tackling Child Poverty, Developing Our Strategy. It summarised the evidence. It defined progress according to 4 key themes, which was income, costs, financial resilience, and also services. And there's an engagement plan in that as well. They also set out that they would use the usual convention of adopting 60% median income after housing costs as the poverty measure. And that was by no means a done deal, we understand. It's quite a breakthrough, actually, after having dealt with the previous government who refused to use any kind of sensible indicator at all. So it's really good that we've now got an official indicator that we can all point to. We also know, and some of the things people asked for early and has happened already, was that there should be a four-nation approach and that there should be local and regional authorities involved, and that sort of engagement has now started to take place. We also wanted consultation with families themselves, with the experts by experience, and that's also starting to happen. We're involved in a project called Changing Realities with the University of York, which is nearly 100 families now across the UK, who have talked to us about what they want to see from policy. They've actually written about social security. Some of them are now confident enough to actually do media work. So it's a really great resource. But they met ministers, some in Scotland, met Liz Kendall yesterday in Scotland, and obviously and officials will be meeting them as well. And lots of us are engaged in running roundtable sessions. So we've been asked to produce roundtable sessions on income. You're not surprised to know. Citizens Advice have done roundtables on costs, IPPR looking at financial resilience, and Save the Children on services. So really good engagement, really good consultation with people, so which is really heartening. So that's all really good. So some outstanding things, though, from what we were calling for and what we haven't yet heard about that are worth kind of going through. And I'm sure Anna will sort of underline some of these as well in a bit. What we want to see in the final plan, some of it is actually from a research project we're doing with impact on urban health. So we've been doing interviews with people who were involved in the last strategy, amongst other things, to find out what people thought worked and was really important to the strategy. So one of the things that everyone has said is that there needs to be an ambitious suite of measures and targets like the last time, and interim targets. Strategies without targets are pretty ineffective, like the one in Wales, nothing to track what's happening. It needs to live beyond the 10 years that's actually set out in this document. And that's because we want poverty eradication, not just child poverty reduction, which is the language that's currently being used, and that will take longer. We want to focus on the groups most at risk, like single parents, Black and minoritized communities, disabled children, homeless children, refugees, and of course incorporation of the UNCRC. And it has to be a strategy that goes across all government departments. And I think we need local child poverty strategies like we had last time, local authorities taking responsibility for their own local action. And of course, social security. There's lots of talk at the moment about employment and a bit of a worry that focus is steering away from social security. Progress won't come from increases in the national minimum wage. If families are going to feel better off in 5 years' time and there's going to be any clear progress, it will come from boosting social security. And there seems to be insufficient focus on that at present. Low-income families rely on social security alongside wages to help get by. Wages don't adjust for family size, they're not meant to. So minimum wage is not that effective at lifting families out of poverty. For parents, it's the number of hours that they're able to supply that's the main problem, not hourly pay. And working more isn't always practical. And above all, we need clear leadership from number 10 and number 11, which we haven't quite had yet. But we need that to insist on action across government, and also to commit the funds. If anybody at Doughty Chambers has any lingering connections with Keir Starmer, please let him know. We need to hear from him about this. And finally, we need clear parameters and a tight focus on policies that actually reduce child poverty. Otherwise, it could become a kind of a rag bag for any policy that mentions children and young people, but doesn't actually reduce child poverty. So you need regular reporting and scrutiny. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Alison. Okay, I'm conscious that Alison has thrown out, many of the positives and the somewhat less positives and where we need to go with that. I know Anna's going to want to come back in. Before we do that, one of the things you talk about in that very importantly, Alison, especially from a child rights perspective, is this notion of the incorporation of the CRC. And our next speaker, Nick Hobbs, who is based at the Scottish Commissioner for Children and Young People, he's the head of advice and investigations, has played a key role as part of the office more generally with regards to the recent incorporation of the UNCRC in devolved legislation in Scotland. And I think Nick is going to speak to us now about the Scottish context, but also focusing in specifically on the opportunities afforded by that piece of legislation, which may, of course, give us, those of us who are not based in Scotland, shall we say, ammunition or impetus to push forward this kind of work in the Westminster context. Right.
Good evening from Edinburgh. Thank you, Aoife. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I am grateful for the invitation, the opportunity to speak to you, and for being able to do it virtually. And I've been asked to talk to you specifically, as Aoife said, about incorporation of the UNCRC into Scots law, which actually came into force, oddly enough, on the 17th of July, the same date that the government announced the poverty strategy. And I'm going to offer a few reflections on how it might be applied to working on poverty. Before I do, for those of you who might not be familiar with us, a few quick words on our office. We were set up through legislation in 2003 with a remit that extends to all children from birth up to 18 and up to 21 for those who've been in the care system. And the Commissioner's statutory function is to promote and safeguard the rights of children and young people in Scotland. And that means that fundamentally our job is to hold government, Scottish and UK governments, accountable to the human rights framework. We explain that often to children as making sure that governments keep the promises they make when they sign up to international treaties like the UNCRC. We're set up in line with the UN's Paris Principles and the terms of the Committee on the Rights of the Child General Comment number 2. And one of the most important aspects of that, and maybe the most critical element to fulfilling our function, is that we're entirely independent of government. So the Commissioner is appointed by the King on the recommendation of Parliament, entirely separate from government. Incorporation's been a long and winding road. I don't have time today to take you through all of that, unfortunately, nor really to speak in much detail about the reference to the Supreme Court in 2021 that resulted in the need for an amended bill to be reconsidered by the Scottish Parliament and then passed in 2024. So I'll stick to the Act as it exists now. And some of what's in it will be familiar to many of you because it's broadly modelled on the Human Rights Act 1998. It requires all public authorities, that includes Scottish ministers, the courts, tribunals, local authorities, health boards, the police, to act compatibly with the UNCRC. But because of the Supreme Court decision, and because the Act has to be kept within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, it's only wholly devolved public bodies that are covered and not in relation to all of their powers and duties. So it depends on the legislative source. So without hopefully kind of overcomplicating things, post-devolution acts of the Scottish Parliament are in scope, except where they amend pre-devolution acts, in which case those amendments are out. And pre-devolution acts of the Westminster Parliament are out entirely, but common law is in. So I'm sure that's entirely simple and straightforward and everyone's grasped that. But what it means is that the scope at present of the Act is a bit more limited than we'd like, but it does still provide us with a really solid and important foundation to build on. And some areas are very clearly within scope of the legislation and others can be brought within scope in due course. And that's one of the arguments that we're consistently making with the Scottish Government now, is that all new legislation has to be drafted in a way that keeps it within scope of the Convention. And we need to be looking at the really significant acts around education and the care system, particularly, that are currently out of scope. The Act provides that failure to act compatibly can be challenged in court by any person with sufficient interest, so it's broader than the victim test for the Human Rights Act, and the courts can provide any remedy that's within their power to grant, and they're required by law to seek the child's views on what the appropriate remedy is. The courts are also required to interpret legislation in line with the CRC, again subject to those limitations on scope. And when interpreting the CRC rights, the court can take into account not only the CRC itself, but optional protocols, preamble, general comments, concluding observations, recommendations following days of general discussion, other international law and comparative law. So it ties the Act really very closely into the broader international human rights framework. That's really important, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Not only will the Scottish courts have an obligation to determine breaches of the UNCRC by public authorities, the courts can make a strike-down declarator or a declarator of incompatibility against legislation that can't be read so as to be compliant with the convention. And there are some procedural provisions too in order to drive culture change, support implementation, and hopefully restrict the need for use of the more direct legal challenges. So the government is required to prepare a children's rights scheme, for instance, which sets out how it's going to advance children's rights in Scotland. And there are obligations on ministers to carry out children's rights impact assessments and make statements of compatibility for new legislation. From our point of view, we're particularly pleased that the Act creates new powers for our office to bring proceedings to court where a public authority has acted incompatibly and to intervene in relevant UNCRC actions raised by others. And to enable us to do that, we receive notification where a question of compatibility with the UNCRC arises in any proceedings before a court or a tribunal. That's in both criminal and civil proceedings. And actually, we've got a live case in each of those at the moment. We are, though, a very small office, only 15 people. And while, in my view at least, we punch well above our weight, we can't intervene in every case, and we have to therefore make some difficult decisions about which cases we take. And we've been very fortunate to be able to take advantage of the expertise of Professor Aoife Nolan and Seaneen Lamb from Impact Social Justice and their work through the Advancing Child Rights in Strategic Litigation project. And so with them and our young advisors, we've developed a toolkit to inform our decision making. And that sets out criteria for taking litigation, including the scale and scope of the rights breach, the prospect of a successful outcome, the impact that it would have. But it also requires us to litigate in a child rights compliant manner. And I'd probably like to say some more about that, but that's maybe a whole other webinar. So what does it look like in practice then applied to poverty in Scotland? Poverty is one of our office's strategic priorities. It's the focus of a lot of our work across our kind of influencing and strategy functions. But for UNCRC litigation, there are some initial challenges that we have to get over. Firstly, that a lot of the relevant powers, particularly around social security, are reserved to Westminster and therefore out of scope of that UNCRC Act challenge. One of the big targets, or one of our big targets for the strategy, is around the two-child cap, but that's not something that we can challenge using the CRC Act. Secondly, even in the devolved space, some of the legislation is pre-devolution and therefore out of scope, at least for now. And thirdly, the courts have traditionally been quite reluctant to interfere with socioeconomic decision-making. And it'll be really interesting to see if direct justiciability of UNCRC rights changes that, particularly given that we can hopefully lead the courts towards some of the wider international law, for instance, around ISESCA, for example. But there are absolutely opportunities to use the UNCRC Act to challenge decision-making and legislation around poverty. And I'm going to give you just a few potential examples. So housing, homelessness, and eviction feel like a really obvious space where a CRC Act challenge might be taken. We're actively looking at cases in that space, interpreting existing powers and duties through a UNCRC lens, reflecting some of the concluding observations from the committee, particularly around best interests and eviction proceedings. The Scottish Government's going to announce early next year that it's missed its statutory child poverty targets, which might then open up the possibility of litigation around the adequacy of its approach to the next set of targets, which is due to be reported on in 2030. Looking at policies at local authority level, there are questions that have been raised with us around the approach that local authorities take to providing grants to adapt housing for disabled children. Those policies might lend themselves to legal challenge. Or we might be able to consider whether specific pieces of legislation are fully rights compliant themselves. So the CRC Act opens up a really wide range of opportunities and levers for us to apply to poverty in Scotland. It's still very early days, but that's our thinking with an act that is unfortunately limited by the current devolution settlements. And I'd like to maybe leave you with the thought that if the UK government is developing a strategy with a genuinely child rights approach, then it must surely include active consideration of incorporating, in part, if not in whole, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Imagine what we could all achieve with a UK-wide UNCRC Incorporation Act with all of those levers at our disposal. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Nick, as you say, imagine what we could achieve on that front, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. I know you can't stay with us, but thank you so much for that insight into what is frankly, legislatively anyway, a much more progressive, albeit limited context than the one in which people working in the English context, for instance, are dealing with, or indeed Wales or Northern Ireland. We've been joined by, great pleasure, we've been joined by our speaker, Sam, who is a member of the National Citizens Bureau's FLAIR group, but as you will see from his biography, has many, many other strings to his bow. He's a sports fanatic, he coaches football, he's a college student, he's a total foodie, he's an advocate. I will let you tell your own story anyway, Sam, but thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sorry that you were disadvantaged by the ridiculously inadequate taxi system of London. But thank you for coming to Newcastle and then having a massive problem in London. I'm sorry about that. I'm ashamed for our city, but take it away. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today to speak about this important topic. I want to talk about poverty with the additional aspect of having a disability. The UK charity Scope, who support disabled people and their families, have published a report this year highlighting the extra costs to disabled households. They estimate this to be an additional £1,010 per month compared to non-disabled households. On average, they state that the extra cost of disability is equivalent to 67% of household income after housing costs. Scope call this the disability price tag. From a personal point of view, the extra costs of my disability are things such as needing the heating on to keep me warm because I don't move around, charging all of my equipment, including my wheelchair and hoists, and especially disability equipment. Thankfully, there are services that provide my wheelchair and equipment for home. However, what you are offered is not sufficient if you want to live a full life. Just to give you an idea, when I travel, I need to take a portable shower and toilet chair. Without it, my personal needs could not be met, and I'd not be here today. The cost of this specialist seat was almost £2,000. I also have other equipment that is not provided as standard, such as portable ramps, which all mounts up. Without access to expensive technology, I would not be able to do anything at all. I would not be able to learn, be able to read or write, and I certainly wouldn't be able to be here speaking to you all tonight. You can imagine the considerable costs involved. I would like to highlight at this point that I, personally, do not live in poverty. When I was asked to speak at this event on this topic, I thought to myself, but I am lucky. I have a lot of challenges in life, but thankfully these are not related to being hungry, cold, not having a bed to sleep in, or not having the equipment I need to overcome my disability. It is a huge worry that there are so many disabled young people in positions a lot less fortunate than my own. That is why I am here today, to speak up for and represent those children and young people who can't speak up for themselves. Despite my relatively fortunate position, I have had my own financial battles very recently. Over the last year, I have had a long and stressful battle with my local authority to fund the support I needed to transition into post-16 education and also to be supported at home and in the community to develop my independence. To say it was an ordeal is an understatement. I ended up crowdfunding for the money I needed to pay the costs of my support to start college. Eventually, I won my appeal and my funding was awarded. However, there are so many challenges to winning these sorts of battles. My mum gave up work years ago to be my carer. If she had been working, there is no way our family would have had the capacity to take on the fight. Families living in poverty are at an automatic disadvantage as they have less money, less time, and most are, very likely, suffering the consequences of struggling, such as poor mental health, and a general feeling that they are beaten. Moving on to a different theme, I would like to bring your attention to the subject of work experience for disabled young people. There are much less opportunities out there, which has the knock-on effect of young people with disabilities having reduced opportunities for work. I want to be a football coach and have known what I wanted to do as a career for years. However, I ended up doing my work experience in the PE department in my school. It was too difficult to find a placement. The point I am making is that the inequality in access to work experience leads to the same inequality in the workplace. Not only do disabled young people have extra living costs, they also have reduced opportunities to work. I am so much more career focused than anyone I know. I have determination, goals and ambition. However, the limiting factor is my disability. Despite my positive outlook, I expect that I won't be able to earn a very good wage as an adult. Social mobility, for me, will be in a negative direction. I will definitely be reliant on my parents and the welfare state for the rest of my life. Unless I win the lottery, that is. One of my main passions is equity. I usually talk about this when speaking about disability, but it is the same no matter what the situation is. Young people in poverty need to be given what they need to have equality of opportunity. This year, I presented at a big event with the NCS called the North East Youth Symposium. I would like to use this opportunity to amplify the collective youth voice from the North East and highlight one of the main themes that young people want decision makers to focus on, which is poverty and inequality. I try to do as much as I can to help other children and young people with a disability. I belong to multiple local youth voice groups, as well as the NCB's FLED group, who advised the DFE I applied for and was recently elected as the Disabilities Officer for my college. And I am very pleased to have started my own business called Dream Big, Live Bigger, where I am proud to be a disability rights activist. I am very grateful to have been given the opportunity this evening to contribute on behalf of children and young people living in poverty, and I hope that I have been able to highlight some of the extra struggles of those with disabilities.
Thanks so much for that, Sam. You certainly have. And can I say, but I think, you know, to just hone in on a couple of things that I'm sure will be picked up again, this notion of the disability price tag, the idea of reduced opportunities, limited social mobility, that obviously are strong for all people living, living in poverty, but for disabled people living in poverty are even more extreme and even more enhanced. So thank you so much for that. I'm now going to turn to our final speaker before we pull people in, Jamie Burton, who has the enjoyable job of final comments, and I think is hoping to engage with what others have said a little bit.
Thanks very much, Aoife, and indeed all the other speakers on the panel. I think my qualification for being on this panel is a singular one, which is I'm old enough to remember the New Labour days too, and I remember litigating against them in the same way that I tried to do against subsequent governments who, of course, introduced a slightly different approach to child poverty and human rights, to put it mildly. I'm extremely struck by Alison's positivity and grateful for it. It made me feel better for a few moments, because I thought, well, if Alison feels positive, because Alison really does know everything about child poverty, then who am I to be negative? The problem, however, is this. First of all, our dear chair has told me to talk about litigation and child rights. And it's very hard to do that without sounding negative, because of course, if everything's perfect, then we lawyers have nothing to do. But the second more real reason is money. The difference between now and when New Labour came into power is the state of the public finances, which are drastically different. And I'm afraid to say, Alison, I was equally struck by the fact that when you set out your wish list, all of them cost money. Yeah. And that is the harsh reality. And as much as I really do wish that somehow we could make Jeremy Clarkson pay for all the eradication of child poverty, I don't think that's going to happen. So it is a very different picture. And it's a dangerous one politically, in my view, and this is the only politics bit I'm going to do, I promise. Because a lot of what Labour are suggesting is wait. It's called growth, but what it really means is wait. And the question really is, can we afford to wait any longer after 14 years of austerity? And I think it's a real problem. which brings me on to the rights-based approach. Yes, it's true to say that one of the first requirements of a rights-based approach is have a plan, have a comprehensive, holistic plan. So good that we might have that. But it's kind of implicit that that plan should be one that reflects a rights-based approach. And we don't yet know if we're going to have that, but the signs are not necessarily particularly positive, as Aoife's already pointed out. And a rights-based approach really does matter when you're trying to build back, in fact. When money is tight, you have to have principles and a framework by which you can make decisions about respective priorities. And I'm worried that that's not going to be there. And that might mean it's more ad hoc and it's pulled about by politics more than we'd like. To take one strong example of that, one can absolutely understand the emphasis on early years and younger children, but what about older children who are experiencing poverty now? What are we doing to help them? How do we make sure they are not forgotten in this process? But also when it comes to litigation, rights matter in a different way. And I want to take the example of the two-child benefit rule, because to me, this really exemplifies where we are and the problem that we're in. So for those of you who don't know, two-child benefit rule is about the two-child benefit. And the Supreme Court, in a case called SC versus Department of Work and Pensions, decided it was perfectly lawful to basically have a system which stopped subsistence benefits after the second child. So irrespective of how many more children you have, with a couple of minor exceptions, you get no extra subsistence money. So it's intentionally, by policy design, putting the third and thereafter children directly into poverty. And that was challenged, as you might expect, but it was challenged within the parameters of our existing human rights protections, which offered only one way in, which was discrimination, which would just somehow say that this was about treating one group worse than another group, when in fact everybody was treated badly. It wasn't a helpful way to analyse the problem. But really importantly, Lord Reid, who gave the lead judgment, did two things. One, he said, all that early optimism you had about we as judges introducing international human rights law through the covenants, etc., is over as of today. We're not going to do that. And Strasbourg hasn't done it either. And if Strasbourg hasn't done it, we're definitely not going to do it. There's a spurious nature to that reasoning, which I won't trouble you with. But the bottom line is the Supreme Court in this country is not interested in doing it by itself. So if we're going to get these rights, it has to be done politically. But then the really interesting point was this: when he tried to articulate why the court was unable fundamentally to determine the question that was being asked of it, was this such a bad policy that the court should strike it down? He said, well, we've got no standard by which to measure whether or not the balance has been struck correctly between the individual children who are going to be affected and the nation as a whole and the public finances. That conundrum would not have existed if he had an enforceable set of child's rights by which he could then measure whether or not that had been done correctly. And the way in which he would have done it said, well, actually for these children, their rights would be so obviously interfered with in a disproportionate way because they're left with nothing. There isn't really any way in which that can be justified. And it would have been a breach, in my view, of their rights to an adequate standard of living. And the court would therefore have had a principle on which to adjudicate the fundamental problem, which I think demonstrates why we need substantive rights rather than just process rights. My final point, and I'll stop, is this. I was very, very struck by one thing listening to Sam and Amir, not only their eloquence in describing the problem that they've experienced directly, but actually more about other people they know have also experienced it, is that some of the things they complained about are already covered by existing statutory entitlements. So what is going wrong? So the other piece of all of this is access to justice. There are a lot of people who practice law in this room who know that on the ground, actually making sure people get the things they're already entitled to, never mind what we can hope for out of this strategy, or indeed, if we're being really bold, in the form of some kind of incorporation of economic and social rights. They're not even getting the things we've already decided they should get. And in the context of care leavers in particular, this is really acute. The legislation is actually quite strong, but it's implemented very badly, some might say cynically, by local authorities, and it requires the sorts of lawyers, several of whom are in this room, I can see you here now, to go above and beyond to try and represent them one by one at a time. That's not a sustainable way of ensuring access to justice. So the other piece Labour must look at in this context, if they're serious about being held to account, is funding the legal aid system properly and ensuring there's adequate access to justice for children too.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jamie. And of course, did I bother introducing Jamie? Of course I didn't. Despite his heroic stepping in. And I should say that Jamie is a King's Counsel, and he's based here at Doughty Street Chambers, and he has acted for claimants in really kind of a hit list of high profile cases during the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. So thank you so much for that, Jamie.
Largely unsuccessfully, I would point out. No.
He's marvelous. Ignore that. But listen, thank you so much. I'm conscious that, very rich presentations, lots of detail, lots of thoughts. I want to throw this open now to the floor. Let's think of it maybe as a moderated conversation. If I can take three, sets of three comments / questions, that might be the best way of doing it, and people can respond or respond to each other. Can I ask that you would identify yourself, just because we know many of you, but you won't all know each other. So please, it's always useful if we know who's speaking and the perspective that we might think they're speaking from. So does anyone want to start it off? Very good. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Monique. I am care experienced and disabled. My perspective is that, first, thank you very much for everyone's input. It was fantastic to hear it. Something that I think has been lacking from trying to help us move forward with our lives is people talking about education. I think one of the reasons that I'm here and able to look like I do, the same with Amir, is that we were lucky in that we had the ability to continue with our education. I left school at 13 and I didn't think I'd go anywhere. That was the hardest part of my life, because unless you see a future where everything's going to be okay or better, that's when you lose hope. And the statistics you're talking about, I know these people, I lost contact with them because I just had to stick with myself and move forward. So I want to ask, with that context, is there anything being done about education? How can that be brought into it? Because I do think there are things that are so discriminatory, especially to care experienced people. The number one thing that I personally think would just change the game is to take away homework, to regulate homework. If you don't have a home to go to, how do you do your homework? If you don't have food, why is there free school lunch, but not dinner if you want us to go home and continue homework? Thank you. I'm sorry it was so long.
Well, Monique, a really important perspective. Thank you. And I think, Anna, maybe I'll get you to come back in on the education point. Anyone else? Yeah. And again, please do say who you are.
Hi there, how you doing? My name is Owen and I work in the Child Poverty Unit and Cabinet Office. I had a question, I guess, for all the panelists, maybe primarily for Alison. This might sound recklessly ambitious, but thinking beyond two-child limit and benefit cap, like what would you want to see in terms of making a strategy that was more permanent and long-lasting? Because obviously, as we all kind of like, the story we're all very familiar with is New Labour came in, made a whole bunch of changes, inevitably lost an election, as all parties will eventually do. And all of those changes, a lot of those changes were then reversed and progress backslid. So in terms of kind of future proofing or sort of thinking more ambitiously, what sort of stuff would you be thinking about?
Okay, thank you very much. Can I take another assessment point? Or maybe we'll, I think that was fairly perfect. Oh, sorry, there's a lady at the front right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lucy Atherton. I'm from Simpson Miller Solicitors. I just had a question in relation to your access to justice point. I work primarily in the SEND sector, and I think it's similar that it seems that sometimes local authorities may take deliberately poor decisions and rely on individuals to challenge them. And I totally agree with your point that there needs to be an increase in access to legal aid. But again, it doesn't seem like a long-term or a wider solution to still be relying on individual challenges, essentially. So do any of the panel have any suggestions in terms of embedding stronger and better decision making within local bodies who are making those decisions in relation to whether it's education or social care or decisions relating to child poverty?
Great, thanks so much for that, Lucy. I think I'll turn back to the panel and ask people to be relatively restrained in their answers, and we can maybe come back in it. I feel that particularly Owen's one is likely to could lead to 27-minute solo efforts by everyone, including myself, but so I won't speak, but we might try to keep it short. But let me, and if you don't mind, I might ask you to address Monique's very important question about this issue of education. And then I don't know whether you also want to touch on the issue of accessibility of, you know, of food poverty as well.
So a sort of broad answer to that, Monique, and thanks for sharing some of your story as well, is that inclusive education needs to be truly inclusive, and we know it's pretty inadequate at the moment. And I would say that it's about creating stability within the care system is the most important part of that. So I don't know about homework, but my response would be that feels like a kind of sticking plaster issue, whereas what we really need to get is absolute security and stability within the care systems, because some of the issues that you face, and I know Amir faced too, is around many placements, and therefore you're away from a consistent relationship with your school. And I think then the second part, and one of the tests that we've got for any child poverty strategy, is around investment in social care, in children's social care. At the moment, as probably most people know, the majority of investment in children's social care is at the acute end, and that's particularly around SEND, so which is costing local authorities huge amounts of money. It's why local authorities are at risk of going bankrupt. So what we really need to see is a shift of that dial and much more investment in early support, so that you've got all that stability built in, would be a simple answer.
Thanks very much, Anna. I think Amir wants to come in on that point as well.
Yeah, so I think to think about is the idea of local offer. Basically, it's a postcode lottery where you are, you know, for example, in Buckinghamshire, if you are under care of Buckinghamshire, anywhere in County Council, if you go, for example, to university or any higher education, they pay for all years of your accommodation. So let's say you go to university for 3 or 4 years, and they pay privately for that 3 or 4 years. But if you're like me from London Borough of Hillingdon, which obviously because of Heathrow and the different areas, they have so many young children, they won't give you anything. So I think creating a system that, you know, bridges the gap between those local offers, so we can offer that to everybody, not just because of local, you know, postcode lottery, basically, would be helpful too.
Thank you very much, Amir. I'm going to turn over to Jamie for Lucy's question on access, just because I think it was directed towards. So, your thoughts?
One of the hardest things to do by way of education, what could be best described as almost intentionally poor implementation of existing statutory entitlements. Because if you're not looking at policy, which is unlawful, you're just looking at kind of deliberately evasive approaches to decision making. It is very hard, but it can be done. I, with some other people in this room, have tried to do it in the context of various leaving care entitlements, done it in the context, for example, of homeless persons departments in local authorities who try to send people away without, you know, giving them what they're entitled to, for various crappy reasons, you know. So it can be done, but admittedly it's very difficult. And ultimately it shouldn't really be necessary, because you should be in a position to properly represent them individually. And that's one of the problems. The capacity in the system is so low. I can't pass without answering Owen's point very quickly. Are we going to do that separately?
Yeah. Sorry about that. I'm going to.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, brutal cutting off the knees. No, the reason is because actually I think we're going to throw open Owen's question. I think I want to throw open to Anna and to Alison as well. And I'm going to get Alison to start off there briefly. You know, what do you want to see in a future strategy? Maybe use your on the microphone. Maybe.
Oh, yes.
No, it's fine. It's just the
Yeah, I'd love to get beyond the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. Bored, frankly. Need to move on and get past it. It's just desperately needs to happen. There was all-party consensus about the Child Poverty Act that was passed at the tail end of the Labour administration in 2010, March 2010, in fact. Couldn't be more last minute if it tried. It might be a good idea to introduce legislation much earlier on in this strategy, so that it's got time to embed and is then regarded as something that's a permanent feature of our legislative life. The other thing that's really important to think about is the government rhetoric during the last child poverty strategy didn't really foreground the child poverty strategy very much. There was very little attempt to explain to the public what they were doing. There was a lot of policy making by stealth. And the famous phrase at the time was talking Daily Mail and acting Guardian. So that you'd get sort of headlines about, forcing people, the work shy into work. And it turned out it was a nice bit of money for childcare in the New Deal for lone parents. So there was a real problem with making sort of talking up punitive approaches while not explaining that actually there was a lot of good being done and that a big difference was being made. And that made it hard to hold on to things afterwards because people hadn't understood their function. Things like Sure Start. Some things did survive. Free entitlement survived. Some other things did survive. But it was easy, therefore, to take away because the public didn't really recognise what they were there for. And that takes leadership and changing the language and not using sort of negative language about things like social security, for example. Because that just encourages people to think that there's something wasteful about social security spending when it's actually investment in children and families. And that needs to be understood. So yeah, and I think it's still possible to get all party consensus about a lot of the things that could be in a child poverty strategy. There was last time in getting the legislation through, for example. So that's something well worth working on.
So much, Alison. That's such an important point around the rhetoric and the way in which, even when you're doing good things, it's about this language of responsibilization. And
and then they didn't defend what they achieved afterwards.
Yeah,
there was total silence from Labour after the coalition got in 2010, which was so silly.
Thank you very much for that. No, I think it's very, I think all of it's very important in terms of context because it shows where the seeds are sown and obviously what we need to push back on more broadly now. It isn't simply about bringing the perfect act, perfect, policy. Anna, do you want to come in?
Only one thing to add, which is an obvious thing given who I'm surrounded by this evening, which is that if you think about the large numbers of children and young people that are living in poverty, their experience really must be heard and listened to by the legislative makers. And that I'm not sure happened as well last time. There's a real opportunity to do that. You've got incredibly articulate people who can express themselves, who will be listened to, who should be listened to. So I'd say that is the most.
And I think it's fundamental because again, the focus of tonight is child rights, and you cannot do stuff about children without them in terms of if you're taking a rights-based approach, if you're making any effort, even a basic effort to adhere to standards of international child rights law that the UK has signed up to. So we have, you should do it. It's a more effective reason for doing it, but there's also the international legal obligation to do so. Jamie, let me pass over to you.
I really agree with Alison about leadership, 100%. Two quick points about that. One, I think the original reluctance expressed about repealing the two-child benefit rule was much more about politics than money, because I think they felt it read very badly with Daily Mail because of this idea that people who are working can't choose how many children they have and people on benefits shouldn't be able to either. The second one is I think the reluctance to defend their record on human rights in particular is also problematic. When Dominic Raab had his human rights bill, there was a real debate in the Labour Party, could they defend that? And could they defend it in a way which didn't actually have to mention the word human rights? So it's a very problematic dynamic for Labour that they need to get over. Which brings me to the final point, which is really what I wanted to say. Legacy is the key thing for this Labour government. And you can't get that legacy without entrenching the rights. Otherwise, it's all susceptible to immediate change by the next government. And, it would be anyway, even if you had, an act which amended the Human Rights Act or added further rights, but it'd be much harder to overturn it, particularly though, if you do the leadership bit behind it. And if Labour really do want to change this country in a positive way, they need to learn the right lessons from the rise of reform and not the wrong lessons, and actually double down on the things they believe in and resist the temptation to try and out Farage, which is of course impossible to do.
Absolutely. He is the original in so many ways. Let me turn around and see if we can take another round of questions/comments. Okay. Perfect, great. So there's there and also a second person. So let me take you first, please.
Thanks.
And please identify yourself.
Is that on now? Yeah. Ollie Studdett, Owen Mitchell. I've been doing children's rights work probably as long as Jamie has, so another dinosaur in the room. And it's sort of to take a collective number of points that have been raised around money, both from the legal side, but also from the local government side, central government side. there are fewer and fewer solicitors doing this work. There are more and more inquiries coming in on a weekly basis. It is incredibly frustrating knowing that we can't take them on. When we do take them on, local authorities concede. We know there are internal policies. We can't get our hands on these policies. They're probably unwritten policies. If we can bring bigger challenges rather than on an individual basis. We're seeing advocates having less success in fighting successfully on behalf of these children. It takes the solicitors to get involved. Local authorities cave. I've had discussions with local authorities about bringing challenges against central government. They say we haven't got the money. Off the record, we know they don't have the money. We know that they're going bankrupt. We know they have to make difficult decisions. But until they start challenging central government and bringing these challenges, things aren't going to change from a financial perspective, I think. Just a plea to encourage people to have these conversations with local authorities, to try and encourage local authorities. We will act for them. We will help them. We will do these challenges with them.
Thank you so much for that, Ollie. Absolutely. And, you know, again, very much engaging with the challenges that are faced in the current context and that aren't simply subject to a quick fix.
I'm Polly Glynn at Dighton Pearce Glynn, and I was going to make the same kind of point. But
I can't hear you. I'm not
sorry,
sure if it's
is
working.
that better?
I'm so sorry. Yes, it is. Thank you.
I'm Polly Glynn at Dighton Pearce Glynn Solicitors, and we also do challenges. I'm frustrated by the issues that, as Jamie has mentioned, are in the law already and are just routinely ignored day after day. And Jamie suggests that the way forward is to launch challenge after challenge. And like Ollie, I am frustrated that that actually doesn't work and doesn't bring any change. And I wonder whether we should be thinking about improved ombudsman system. So where there are systemic issues with certain local authorities refusing homelessness applications for care leavers, for example, refusing to provide care leaver services or refusing to provide basic Care Act assessments in the lawful way, that instead of trying to challenge those on a case-by-case basis, which is economically impossible, that the Ombudsman can be asked to investigate quickly, robustly, and have powers to bring those to account. I totally accept the local authorities have got no money, but at the moment, no one's talking about that because no one outside this small field of public lawyers really understands quite how the law is being ignored. If we can't afford to get people off the streets, then let's just admit that and accept it as a society. But at the moment, we're just ignoring it. And yeah, that's my thing.
Thanks very much. And of course, we're at a time where we're seeing a lot happening around public bodies, and there is, but we need to bear in mind when we talk about ombudsman, etc., there is, of course, in England, the Children's Commissioner, and part of it is about perhaps pushing the institutions that exist in order to engage in a more active rights, using rights language around these issues too. It's not simply, it may not be simply about creating new ones. So I take the point that you're making, Polly. Sorry, total abuse of chair's position. Shushin, did you want to come in there?
Hi, I'm Shushin Liu. I'm a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, and I co-lead the children's rights team with Aoife. I'm actually going to ask a question and not be a lawyer about this. And I wanted to pick up with, on what Amir talked about in terms of the postcode lottery, and what Alison, you talked about in terms of national, regional, and local poverty strategies. Are there inherent tensions with these types of strategies? Because there are going to be inevitably some sort of there are going to be postcode lotteries, different focuses in different regions, different local authorities. And then obviously the elephant in the room is money. And how do we deal with that in the context of a national child poverty strategy, as well as how that then cascades and is consistent with what we do on a local and regional level?
Thanks so much. I'm going to take a couple more questions because I don't think we'll have time for another round.
Hi, I'm Imani, and I work as a statutory advocate for looked after children and care leavers. So this was more a question to you, Amir, or anyone else in the audience that may be care experience. I do find that those that access advocates often aren't from backgrounds such as unaccompanied asylum seekers, people who are disabled. And I do think sometimes these are individuals who need advocacy in terms of, you know, within the local authority the most. And it frustrates me so much to hear that the experiences that you've had, because as others have said, that you have entitlements that clearly weren't being respected. So my question is whether anybody has any advice as to how to reach individuals who do need to access their entitlements and empower them to know what their rights are, and how I as an advocate and others could support you to access them.
Thanks so much for that. And I think there was another question over there. Yep.
Hi, my name's Dan Rosenberg from Simpson Miller Solicitors. In terms of child rights, I do quite a bit of education work, and I see all the time children who suffer in what's colloquially known as isolation. By the numbers I deal with, it must be tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of children. Unlike most things, it doesn't directly cost money to sort out. Yet it still carries on, and it is pretty much normalized now within schools, secondary schools, sorry. Many of the children will have disabilities. Why do you think we've got to that stage?
And can I ask, who would you regard as having a view on that particular issue, given the focus on poverty? Is it to do
Because
with
most of these children, or certainly most of the ones who I speak to, they are from relatively poor families. Most of them, I deal with a lot of children, particularly outside London, families who they often have disabilities. The parents sometimes have disabilities. It's the sort of children who are subjected to this are the sort of children whose parents are not kicking up often a huge fuss, and think, again, to some degree, they are habituated to it. Obviously, the ones who come to me have realized that something has gone wrong, but they are a fraction of the number of children. And I know they're a fraction because I see the data from the schools.
Very much, Dan. Okay, thanks for the helpful clarification as well. There's a range of different questions there. I'm going to start with Shushin's, which I think was really directed probably to Alison, around postcode lottery, unless you want to come in on it as well, Anna. No, Alison, if you're happy to come in there.
Yes, you're right, postcode lottery, but also if there are going to be local authority strategies like there were last time, they were required to have a strategy that lasted for 3 years and then renew it. So obviously some local authorities were much more enthusiastic about what they intended to do, and others wrote a strategy, put it on the shelf and didn't really do much more about it. So I think there's an element where obviously you want regional variation to a certain extent, because that's the point of a local strategy. So local authorities know what their local story is about, why they've had declining industry or what the new industries are. You know, they know what the situation is in their own community. I think there needs to be really clear specification from central government about what sort of things they need to include. Local authorities don't have the national levers, so they can't do something about social security, but they can do things about how they administer their local welfare assistance, for example, or what kind of quality and funding goes into early years education. They can look at schools and provision in schools. GLA at the moment, of course, is creating universal free school meals. So, there are all sorts of differences that can take place around the country. So, obviously, the problem is money. And there's in Scotland, where there's a Child Poverty Act, which basically mirrors the pre-existing UK Child Poverty Act, they have local strategies, but there's no money that follows it. And so local authorities are having good ideas and can't really do much about it. So that has to change. Interestingly, in the budget, there was some additional money for local authorities. That has to continue, because why would the government want to oversee local authorities becoming bankrupt? So yeah, they need to have a clear spec, and they need to understand the local provision that they're in charge of and what they can make a difference about. And the other thing locally that's really important in relation to local authority funding, it relates to Ollie's point. we've been making a case, I'm sure everybody here has been, about the need for more money into legal aid, but also into local authorities for advice. We saw devastation of the advice sector after 2010, because two legs of voluntary sector or local advice services money disappeared. Legal aid funding, and local authorities had no money. They saw a 40% cut in their grants from central government. So we need to get that money back, because the existence of specialist welfare rights workers, for example, disappeared in citizens' advice and in other sectors. So we need to get that back.
So much for that, Alison. I'm sorry for cutting you off.
No,
Just
don't
2 minutes left, but I think it's a hugely important point. With regards to the comment from our colleague who's an advocate, I'm so sorry I managed to fail to write down your name, so my apologies. Amani, thank you very much. Amir is going to come in and give some thoughts on that point.
Yeah, so that's a good question, I guess. Well, obviously, I'm going to speak mostly from my own perspective, my own experiences. But firstly, again, it was only a couple of months ago that people were burning hotels and constantly on the street. So it's not easy to come out and say I'm an asylum seeker in general, whether you're unaccompanied children or adult. I went through years of medical school and nobody knew I was care experienced or asylum seeker. I just created this story in my head, and yeah, total lie, but I was more comfortable saying that to people rather than say who I was. And so I think the stigma around it, we need to do something about that. And the other thing is the opportunities. The way or the reason I'm obviously sitting here is because first year of university, there's this charity called Become Charity, which some of you might be no. They came to uni and they had delivered a speech and lecture, and I approached them. I said, it's very interesting the things you do for caregivers, the caregiver specific charity. And they told me we have these opportunities and you can get actively involved. And I started feeling decent about it, because until then I didn't want to do anything with care for the rest of my life. My experience was really bad. Mm-hmm. But realizing, okay, wait a minute, I can do make a small difference, something that hopefully other children in the future wouldn't be experiencing the same things as I did. It made me happy. So that's why I became quite engaged with Become, and obviously now with NCB. So I was opportunity to get involved. It's not out there. And the stigmas, that will be all.
Thank you so much for that, Amir. I'm going to turn to Anna now on the point that Dan has raised. And I think it's really the kind of disproportionate use of very strong disciplinary measures on children in poverty, often with a link to disability themselves or within their families.
I was going to say something also about, I think I'm really struck by what we're talking about here, which goes to your point too, Sam, about exclusion or isolation in schools, which is there is legislation that deals with this, but it isn't necessarily being used. And one of the things, it's really good to hear that there are advocates in the audience and solicitors who are working on these issues. What we've done in the charity sector is really try to combine forces as much as possible. So through the Council for Disabled Children, which is part of the National Children's Bureau, we have a group of lawyers that work with us that advocate on behalf of children with disabilities and special educational needs. But I'm wondering whether we need to do a bit more to bring more of those groups together, because it feels like there is, certainly much more we should be doing to use the law as it currently stands. And then the second point I think on that is more education for children themselves about their own rights. We try and do that as much as possible through our own resources. But I'm really struck by something that I think both Alison said earlier, which is we kind of got squeamish about using rights language because we were being told so frequently by the previous administration that if you talked about rights in any context, you would be ignored and dismissed. So I think we need to reintroduce rights language, especially in the way we're talking with young people.
Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful. And again, it's easy to criticize the rhetoric from government, but in fact, we ourselves bear responsibility too. No. Absolutely, that's very helpful. So I think I'm now going to, and thank you for responding to Dan's question, I'm now going to turn over to Jamie, who I think will probably have the last word, dealing with the law, and nothing but the law. Sorry, that sounded very directive, but...
It's off a piece, Aoife. I mean, I don't really have a lot more to say. I mean, obviously there was a brief moment there where we all thought maybe the need for the kind of motivated lawyering that we've had to bring to bear over the last 14 years, you know, through austerity, etc., might change. And indeed it might, it almost certainly will change, but it's not, the need for it's not going to go away. And actually, I'm struck by something that a former colleague of this chambers, who's now in a very high up position in the government, but isn't Keir Starmer, said recently, which is that we need you. And it's Richard Hermer, the Attorney General, and he was serious. He was saying that, you know, you need to bring litigation against this. And what he was telling me, I think, effectively was it gives us political cover to do stuff. You know, if we feel mandated, well, you know what, there's a challenge and it's a pretty good challenge. And, you know, the problem is what it is. It gives them, you know, room to negotiate and achieve things within government. And I have to say, and this is all out in the open, so it's okay to say it, that a series of cases that I brought in the beginning of this year, which were challenging things like the paucity of legal aid for certain sectors in society, was about, for example, the failure to uplift disabled facilities grants for disabled people, etc. They settled them positively. So they committed to spending money on them. And I just, you know, would that have happened if those cases had not been there? Maybe, eventually, in due course. But, you know, there was a definite change in tone, the definite change in the form of engagement. And in other respects, I think we're seeing that too. So there are really good reasons to both be positive in the way that Alison has been, but also to hold on to our job. So, you know, in that sense, it's good. That's, yeah.
Serving two very important agendas, absolutely.
Well, they're inviting us to do it. You know?
I know, no, I'm teasing. But can I just check, can I check if David is here very quickly? David, okay, so poor David is being put on the spot because David foolishly identified himself before the event as being based in the Child Poverty Unit at the Cabinet Office. And he said that he would, having received a rather pressurizing email, make a few comments at the end. So actually David will get the last word. It is he that stands between you and a glass of wine or something else. So David.
Everyone, thank you for having me here today. I'm a little poorly, so please go easy on me. So my name is David and I work at the Child Poverty Unit, and I'm here alongside my colleague Owen, who also works at the unit. And I just want to first say thank you for all of the wonderful input that you shared tonight. It was really valuable to hear from such a range of passionate and diverse perspectives. And then to touch a little briefly on the child poverty strategy that was already mentioned quite a bit tonight. It is an urgent priority for this government to tackle child poverty, and it is part of the government's mission to break down barriers to opportunity. The strategy, as it was mentioned already, will be UK-wide, and it will aim to not only look at short-term options, but also long-term options for lasting change for this current parliament, but also beyond it. I want to note as well that on the 23rd of October, we published our launch document, which covers a little bit more about our approach to developing the strategy, including touching on how we are engaging with stakeholders and families and children and so on to bring them into the strategy development. And then finally, I want to also say that children's rights are definitely part of the conversations that we are having at the Child Poverty Unit. So it was really great to kind of hear from you on how we can bring children's rights into poverty more specifically. So very keen to share the points that were made tonight with a wider team and continue working on this issue. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. That's really, I think that's an excellent way to end. I'd just like to very quickly thank Rye, Tushan and Emily for the work around this event on behalf of Doughty Street, and of course, Shushin, who's been fantastic as ever. I'd like to say huge thanks to our speakers, particularly Amir and Sam, who have not only shared their own lived experience expertise, but have also had to travel, and in Sam's case, try multiple times forms of transport and come over various obstacles in that front. But it was very special to have everyone here, but particularly to hear from the two of you today. So thank you, and thank you all so much for coming in on this freezing evening. And now throw yourselves at the drinks and nibbles at the back. Thank you.